go live now to Sydney. I'm joined by the Shadow Attorney-General, Julian Leeser, who has been very critical of the government's change in policy, Julian Leeser, when it comes to Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, and the recognition of that city as the capital of Israel. The government says it should be a final status issue. What's wrong with that in terms of leaving any determination on that to the parties in play there?
Well, there's two things, Kieran. Before the election, Mark Dreyfus and Josh Burns, who, like me, are both Jewish, they wrote in the Jewish press that there was no real difference in policy between the Labor Party and the coalition on the State of Israel. And here we see a very stark difference in policy, where the government has changed the position in relation to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, of West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, in West Jerusalem, that's been part of Israel since the establishment of the modern state in 1948. In West Jerusalem, you have the Knesset, its parliament. You have the Supreme Court. The president lives there. It looks like the capital city of any other country. What we are doing is effectively like saying that that another country doesn't recognise Canberra as the capital, that they effectively would say that Dubbo is the capital. That's the equivalent of what this is. And I think the government should be very careful here, because this is a policy that has been endorsed today, the government's new position, by two organisations that have been listed as terrorist organisations by our own country, by Hamas and by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is a really bad signal about Australia's values and about where we are in relation to standing with our friends. I think the Morrison government had the policy right. And it's extraordinary that the Labor Party has effectively had three positions on this in 24 hours. It just shows the shambolic nature of their foreign policy making.
Isn't the decision in tune, though, with much of the rest of the world? And isn't it also true that only a handful of countries have recognised Jerusalem or West Jerusalem as the capital?
Well, Australia makes its own foreign policy decisions based on facts, and the fact is that West Jerusalem, by any standard definition of the capital of a country, is the capital of Israel. As I say, the parliament's there, the Supreme Court's there, the president lives there. Every other country gets to decide its own capital. I think we should adopt the position of the Morrison government. That was the position we went to the last election with. The Labor Party should have stuck with that position. Jerusalem is the capital, and I don't understand why the Labor Party can't see that.
Penny Wong says that Australia will always be a steadfast friend of Israel, and she says that it was the Morrison government that was using this issue as a cynical political ploy back in 2018 to try and win Wentworth in a by-election. Is that not the case?
Not at all. I think Australia's foreign policy has got to a point where it is mature enough to say that the capital of Israel is West Jerusalem. I think that this is an immature decision by the Labor Party. And the fact that they had effectively three positions on this in 24 hours, the fact that it's been endorsed by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, two organisations that our own country lists as terrorist organisations, says how ridiculous this decision actually is.
Josh Burns, your parliamentary colleague, a Labor member for Macnamara of Jewish faith, he says, I didn't like the Morrison government playing politics with these sensitive issues. It's in my view that any further alteration to Australia's policy needed to be considered extremely carefully. He says, to my disappointment, this did not happen. I know people in my electorate and across Australia are hurt by this decision, and to be honest, so am I. Quite a frank statement from Josh Burns today in response to this decision. Are you hopeful? Is there any prospect of this being overturned?
Well, I hope the Labor Party comes to its senses, but that would represent the fourth position they'd had on this issue in just over a day. I certainly hear from non-Jewish people in my electorate on this issue who are expressing their disappointment in the Labor government's decision here. I think people acknowledge that West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and that the Morrison government was right on this point.
On to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. A number of commentators, including Anthony Wheely KC, former Deputy Commissioner of the ICAC, says that this requirement of exceptional circumstances for the NAC, as it's being called, to have public hearings, looks like a bit of a compromise deal with the coalition. Is that true?
Well, we think that in relation to exceptional circumstances, the government has got that part of the balance right. But there are a range of submitters to the committee that are looking at the National Anti-Corruption Commission bill that have expressed support for public hearings only in limited circumstances. I think of organisations like the Law Council of Australia, like the Queensland Law Society, like the South Australian Bar Association, for instance, like the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties. This is not the first corruption commission that has ever existed. We've had over 30 years of experience of dealing with these corruption commissions, and we have seen them destroy people's reputations, destroy lives. There have been a dozen people who've died by suicide as a result of appearances before these commissions. And yet there have been very few successful prosecutions, and that, I think, is the ultimate key performance indicator for any of these commissions. Do they get convictions? Do they achieve successful prosecutions? And so if you are going to have public hearings, there needs to be important balances and safeguards in place, and I think exceptional circumstances is a good safeguard. I've said, and I've adopted the position of the South Australian Bar Association here, that the person who's actually making these decisions about whether to hold a public hearing should not be the Commissioner itself. It should be an independent judge, like in a warrant process, who can weigh up the various factors there, who can determine whether exceptional circumstances exist, who can determine whether the public interest justifies these things, who can look at the effect of people's well-being, safety and reputation in relation to these issues, because ultimately the Commission, which is a $200-odd million body, will have a real interest in holding public hearings, and I think it's important to have somebody dispassionate who's not interested in whether the hearings are public or not to make that ultimate assessment.
What sort of feedback have you received from the government? Has it been positive? Are they taking your suggestion on that and on other matters constructively?
Well, look, we've been having a lot of discussions with the government over the last period since I've been the Shadow Attorney-General in relation to this. I won't go into the nature of those discussions, but obviously where we are at the moment is we've got this committee process, and I think we're waiting to see the evidence that comes before this committee. But I know there's been a view in some government circles that, the legislation is perfect. That is not what is borne out in the evidence that's been given to this committee through submissions made by the Law Council and some of the other legal bodies that I've mentioned, also through submissions made by the inspectors in New South Wales and Victoria, and even by the former National Security Legislation Monitor. So there are a range of areas where I think some of the safeguards need to be tightened, whether that's on the definition of corruption itself, whether it's on the availability of judicial review, whether it's on the way in which the determination about public hearings are made, or whether it's in relation to the powers of the inspector. And I think a lot of that evidence is being borne out by the serious contribution made by independent legal bodies like the ones that I've mentioned.
Shadow Attorney-General Julian Leeser, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kieran.